In Module 13, we're going to talk about cost-profit volume analysis and operating leverage. The specific topics we'll cover would be as follows. What is the definition of a break-even? How is it used? How do we make a break-even calculation? Then we need to look at break-even for multiple products. And lastly, what is an operating leverage and how do we calculate operating leverages? And what do they mean as far as management is concerned? When we're looking at break-even, basically what we're talking about is at what point does the total revenue equal the total costs? And that intersection is known as the break-even. Graphically, it looks something like this. We have a fixed cost line, we have a variable cost line, and we have a total revenue line. So you'll notice that in the lower triangle, before the revenue line crosses the cost line, we're in a position where we have a loss. At the point of intersection, we have neither a profit nor a loss. And then as the revenue line exceeds the total cost line, we're in a profit situation. And the reason the total cost line and the total revenue line are separating at a fairly rapid rate is that we are spreading our fixed costs over more units. If you recall from the last module, we went through a situation where we said the total cost per unit will drop the longer we can spread our total costs over more units. So when does the break-even occur? I think there's a misconception normally on the part of most students that the break-even occurs very early in the month. Let me give an example. Most retailers make about 3% to the bottom line. Now, if you think about it, there are 30 days in the month. This would mean that most retailers are going to break even on the last day of the month when they reach the last 3% of their revenue. Even companies such as Microsoft probably do not break even until something like the 25th or 26th day of the month. And I'm sure some of you have been exposed to a situation where on the last couple of days of the month, the boss gets really excited and beats everybody up wanting to get the sales in and get them booked. Well, the reason for that is those sales represent the profit for the entire month. And if they're not booked, then probably they'll have a loss. Even think about a store like Albertsons. Probably they don't break even until afternoon on the last day of the month because the majority of that grocery shopping will happen in the last half of the day. So monitoring your break-even is very, very important. And knowing how to calculate it and plan it is even more important. In order to arrive at the break-even, we need to learn how to calculate the contribution margin and the contribution margin ratio. Here's a schedule that's got two columns in it, dollars and ratio. The sales price per unit is $2. The variable cost is $1.40. The contribution margin is 60 cents. So this means that for every unit that is sold, it contributes 60 cents to contribute toward covering the fixed costs, taxes, and provide a net profit. So the term contribution is very appropriate because it contributes to covering the fixed costs, taxes, and provide the net profit. Now the contribution margin ratio is arrived at by dividing the sales price into the variable cost, 70%, dividing the sales price into the contribution margin, 30%. The reason we calculate the contribution margin ratio is that there are times when we do not know what the actual contribution margin per unit is, but we can calculate the ratio and use that to make our break-even calculations. So, in this example, let's assume we have fixed costs of $120,000. So, the formula to calculate the break-even is fixed costs divided by contribution margin per unit. So if you divide the fixed costs of $120,000 by 60 cents, you get 200 units. So this means that when the firm reaches 200,000 units, they are breaking even. At 199, they're losing money. At 2001, they're making money. Now we also want to know, what is the contribution margin in terms of sales dollars? And we could reach that in two different ways. We could take the break-even in number of units, which is 200,000, and multiply it by the sales dollars per unit, which is $2 per unit, and we come up with $400,000. Or we can use the contribution margin ratio. In using the contribution margin ratio, we take the fixed cost and divide them by 30%, and again, you'll arrive at $400,000. So there are two ways to calculate the break-even for sales dollars. We not only want to know the break-even in units, but we want to know what it will be in sales dollars for planning purposes. Now, managers pay a lot of attention to the mix of fixed and variable costs, and this was discussed in a previous lecture. Quite often, they can trade off a fixed cost for a variable cost and lower the break-even point. The goal is to push the break-even point as far down the axis as you possibly can. The sooner you break even, the sooner you're going to make a profit. For example, let's talk about the trucking industry. Trucking companies can buy their property damage insurance two different ways. They can buy it with a flat premium per month, which would be a fixed cost, or they can buy it by the mile, which would be a variable cost. If they buy it by the mile and they don't travel anyplace, they have no property damage insurance to pay. So quite often they will analyze this and say, which is the better way for us to buy our insurance? And they might shift from a fixed cost to a variable cost. And there are many other examples of that, where management will try to trade off a fixed and a variable cost to try to reduce the break-even point. Now, when you start talking about making a profit, which we are here, then the government gets very interested in your operation. They're not going to be hanging around too long if you're talking about making a loss, but when you start getting profitable, they want their share. And so then we take into concept the targeted profit. So now our formula for break even is fixed costs plus the targeted profit divided by 1 minus the tax rate, and then both of those figures divided by the contribution margin per unit. So let us assume now that we want to make a profit of $30,000 after tax. Our tax rate is 40%. Our fixed costs are still $120,000, just as we saw in the previous calculation. And our contribution margin per unit is still 60 cents. So the first thing we do is we subtract 40% from 1, and we get 60% in the denominator for the profit. Then if you divide $30,000 by 0.60, you arrive at $50,000. So now your before profit is $50,000, your after profit is $30,000, so you're going to be paying $20,000 in tax. So to get the break even in units now, you'd have to take the $120,000 plus $50,000 divided by 0.60, and the break even is now $283,333. So it has gone from $200,000 to $283,000 when you take profit into consideration. This is a very interesting graph. No, I didn't have 3 martinis before I drew these lines. In fact, quite frankly, these lines are quite representative of the way cost and revenue lines look. They're much more realistic than the nice, clean, vertical and horizontal and straight linear lines that the economists like to use. You'll notice that we have a pocket in the lower left-hand side. In that long, elongated pocket, that we're in a loss position because the cost line is above the revenue line. All of a sudden, we drop into a profitable pocket where the cost line drops below the revenue line. So in that area, we are in a profitable position. And then, all of a sudden, the cost line exceeds the revenue line. What this is telling us that businesses have a certain lifestyle, they have a certain age to them. And as they expand and take on more and more fixed costs, they must be very careful that they earn the revenues that will cover those costs. We put fixed costs on in big chunks, and so quite often it's difficult to have the revenues increase as rapidly as the costs do. Now up there someplace again, hopefully the revenue line will go up and will cross that cost line again, and the firm will become profitable. If you look at different size businesses, they all have a maximum type of efficiency as far as their costs are concerned. And this is called the economy of scale. A professor at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business, George Stigler, did a study of the aluminum industry and the automobile industry and the steel industry from the 1920s until the late 1950s, early 60s. And he found that the companies moved in certain long steps. And if once they got into a loss pocket, quite often they could not move past that and ultimately went broke. So a business person needs to be very much aware of the fact that as they expand and get bigger, that doesn't mean they're going to get more profitable in all cases. They might be walking into a situation where they're going to see a loss. So be very much aware that your break-evens occur in multiple sizes and points.